Hey ballers! In this episode, I'm joined by Glenn Lowenstein and Shannon Ware of Terran Solutions to talk about a crucial part of investing wisely, environmental assessments. Turned out it was more fun than I thought it would be. We had a great time talking and diving into why these assessments matter, from mold to asbestos, to water, to geological risk. And it's not only for new constructions, but it's knowledge I believe you should have. Before we dive in, I'm V. Lee, and you are listening to the Real Estate Ballers Show. We are a growing channel. We have been growing organically, and we could really use your help. Can you hit that subscribe button and share this episode with a friend? It helps this channel more than you know and allows us to help more people achieve financial freedom through real estate investing. Thank you and enjoy the episode. I'm sorry for this interruption. I've been asked a lot about passive investment, and I understand that there is nothing passive about being a landlord unless you can find a great property management company. So if you own an Airbnb, a vacation rental, or a short-term rental, and you are looking to free up your time, contact our team at Buzz Vacation Rentals at 281-549-8432 or check out our website at www.buzzvacationrentals.com. Thank you, and back to the Real Estate Baller Show. This episode is brought to you by Jet Lending. For over 20 years, Jet Lending has been helping real estate investors succeed. They offer 100% financing so you can be in at $0 at closing. I can always count on Jet Lending to fund my deals. If you're looking to fund your next deal, contact our friend over at jetlending.com. This episode is brought to you by National Real Estate Insurance Group, a national independent insurance agency specifically for real estate investors. I personally use NREIG for my investment properties. They offer a low monthly payment option to help you to lower your cash out of pocket when buying an investment property. If you're looking for insurance coverage for your flips or your rental, reach out to them. You can click on the link in the show descriptions, or you can reach out to Jules at 816-946-8443. Okay, so today I got Glenn Lowenstein. Apologies if I didn't say your last name correctly. And Shannon Ware here with us, talking about stuff that we don't typically talk about in the real estate space. And I think it's the fun stuff. And so before I babble any further, one of you guys, Glenn or Shannon, you guys want to take over and start, just tell us what it is that you do.
Yeah, so my name, like you said, is Glenn Lowenstein. I'm a professional geoscientist, licensed in the state of Texas. I've been doing environmental work for 35 years. Shannon Ware, sitting next to me, she's a newcomer to the business, so I wanted to give both perspectives of someone who's been here a long time and someone who's a recent comer. We both work at Terran Solutions. It is a Houston-based company with 7 folks, professionals that deal with both commercial and residential properties. The main source of the main services, we offer something called Phase 1 environmental site assessments, which is typically required by stakeholders and third-party lenders prior to the purchase of a property. It involves single-family homes all the way through subdivisions, and the reason it's required or is considered best practice by a bank or lending institution, if the owner doesn't meet his financial obligations and there is a foreclosure, the bank doesn't want to own a property that is environmentally damaged. What does that mean? Well, there are various things that can impact a home environmental, starting from below the foundation is the land, and the groundwater could have been contaminated by the past owners or historical use. There was also the presence of asbestos, a fire retardant subject that was outlawed some 20, 30 years ago, but it's still in use and we still find it. There's mold, which grows in our lovely damp environment here in Houston. And additionally, there's lead paint, which if children ingest it or is exposed to you through dust can cause all sorts of health hazards. So we offer all of these services prior to purchase of a home.
So you guys do this to single family home that already built, or is it new constructions, or, and is your service specifically for commercial building property? Tell us a little bit more about that. Like, who needs you?
So really, I think everybody should use that. I've seen a lot of arguments saying, well, the average phase one study runs about $2,500. And a lot of people think, well, my home is $250,000 to $500,000, it's not worth it. And the banks don't require it for single family homes. But I'm thinking for $2,500 to protect your investment in a home that you might be living in 10 years or so, or even if you're flipping the home and you don't want that, an objection later on where someone says, how come you didn't tell me there was asbestos? Or why does it smell funny in here? Or why is it covered in mold? So I guess the presumption is it's not worth it for $250,000 or $500,000 home. So typically we'll do it prior to subdivision being bought. There's at least two infamous cases that I know of. One is Kennedy Heights, where the subdivision didn't do the phase one. It was built and people ended up with all sorts of health-related problems because it was built on an old chemical plant. And then there's Love Canal, which set all of this in action in New York, which was a similar situation. Division that was built by nefarious developers who didn't do the phase one, the study to find out if it was contaminated, and as a result, people built homes in it. As well as the commercial structures we do it for because they have higher value, and they typically always involve some sort of stakeholder or bank or investor, and they have more uses such as dry cleaners, gas stations, nail salons we've had problems with, and those things open them up to all sorts of chemical use that's not done typically in a single family home.
It's funny, this is non-related, but when you said dry cleaners, it brought me back some memory when I was looking into a commercial washing facility, a laundry facility. Because we in the short-term rental business, so we do a lot of laundry. And I did not realize how much chemical a laundry facility could dispose every day. That's something I just never knew.
So there was this very young family that owned and operated a laundromat, not a dry cleaner, just a typical laundromat. And the city shut them down because there was something called acetone, which you might recognize as nail polish remover. And they had young children, like babies, in the facility, so you could tell that this was a family business. They couldn't afford to be shut down. They kept telling me, we never used acetone, we never used acetone. And it finally turned out to be in some product, and we kept flushing through the system. If you're familiar with your sanitary in the home, the sanitary water, there's no sample location point. But in businesses, there's a little place where they can collect a sample before it joins the city's sanitary line. And every time they tested, there was acetone. So we had to do this triple washing to get this chemical out of it so the facility could open again. So while that's not an example of a single family residence, it's an example of somebody who's very dependent on this and needed to be able to figure out where it was coming from and how to get their business back and up and running.
So the acetone come from one of the products they use to do the laundry?
From memory, I thought it was a spot cleaner at one point they had used, and they kept eliminating detergents they were using. They were trying to buy the clean earth. They were just going nuts. The spot cleaning you have to do because you can't bring dirty. You can't return it to the client with a spot. So they found eventually things that were less toxic, at least.
Wow, what in the world? I would never have thought you'd find acetone in a laundromat.
Neither did I.
So, okay, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe the builder or someone who's buying, like you said, a dry cleaner, a previous gas stations, and consider to, change it into something else, may need what you provide, the phase 1 inspection.
Correct. Change of use. I already made the argument that maybe every home should have one, but I can understand that would not be, I guess, cost effective from a person's standpoint, given all the other expenses associated with buying a home. But change of use is a frequent problem. If one person's buying a gas station or selling one, he doesn't want to buy the pre-existing problems. So we do this due diligence to make sure that the station is leak-free. I watched a gentleman buy a gas station. The bank didn't require phase 1, so he purchased it without doing any due diligence or phase 1 investigation. And the business, it turned out to be a bad deal. His father had a stroke. He had to sell the facility. And the next person did the phase 1 and said, "Oh, I'm not buying that." He did some testing and said, "Your tank's leaked." 23 monitoring wells later, so a quick explanation of a monitoring well is a water test well that could be 25 to 30 feet under the ground. The man had a massive plume. Thank goodness he had insurance, but still he couldn't sell. No one would buy until it was cleaned up.
Wow. Can you give an estimate on what that cleanup cost would be?
Yeah, so most policies regarding that are $1 million. That's the usual cap. It has not reached $1 million. The average I see for that description, and that's on the bad side, would be $250,000 to $500,000. That includes testing, remediation, and it's a place no one wants to be.
So that pretty much make that piece of land property useless at that point.
And then you get third-party people, right? Because it may affect other sales if you're in a commercial area, and they're like, "Oh, I'm not buying that because it's this contamination coming from this gas station." It affects the value, even if it's just a stigma. It's not scientific that the gas is going to hurt you into the ground. It causes additional hardship when you're doing a study and you're trying to tell the stakeholder, the bank, that this is worth the value. And it's something that's not caused by you, but it could impact the value of the property.
Well, so I'm speaking from an investor perspective now. It's not that we want to avoid problem, but like one of the words you use is cost effective or cost prohibited. Sometimes we don't go look for problems, right? But if we detect something, if we suspect something, then that's when we do, order test.
There are some people who say, if I don't know, then I'm innocent. And I guess I understand that strategy. I see with home sales, they'll say, are you aware sometimes of mold or asbestos in your home? And they're like, well, I don't want to test it and find the problem. So there's the right thing to do. You certainly don't want to sell a home. I saw a case where a young family and a baby was moving, and we did asbestos testing, but it was after the purchase. And there's something called popcorn texturing. That's that kind of texture in sheetrocks or ceiling. And so there's doing the right thing. There's claiming that you didn't know about it. But if they're smart enough to come in and do the testing, then everything's out. And sometimes the buyer comes in who's very knowledgeable and says, look, you have asbestos, you have mold. And now you know about it. Even though you didn't want to know about it, it has come. So my thought process is, I like to sleep at night. I'm sure most of the investors do. And it's better to pay above board to at least gain the knowledge. What you do with that knowledge is up to you, knowing what problems are there with the property.
Well, okay, so let's just speak hypothetical for a moment. If I am like this perfect angel who's flip houses, right? And every time I buy a house, I want to do your full scope test. The asbestos, the mold, all of those tests. Wouldn't you say that my chances of finding problem in these homes, like this, would be like 70, 80%? Every home will have something?
Yeah, well, it's a degree of severity. I wouldn't say every home is going to have asbestos. I've seen asbestos mostly in commercial buildings or older style homes. And now that people are buying in the Heights, these knockdown homes, there's something called transguide, and it's a paneling that's asbestos. So it's a question of, as you said, doing the right thing. It's also another thing is that demolition crew, it's required by the city of Houston if you're demolishing structures. It's a little vague about whether it's a private residence. You may be able to get away with it, but definitely big buildings, when they're knocked down, create all this dust, which really goes in the neighborhood if it has asbestos. So I wouldn't say it's prevalent in every place. I've seen well taken care of homes that don't have mold. Newer homes don't have asbestos. Lead paint hasn't been used in a while. It tend to be used more in commercial. It's a personal choice if it's not required of how you want to do business in this world and what you think the risk is. If you think, wow, I went through that. Have you ever gone into a home that's been closed for a while and say, oh man, it smells musty and moldy, right? So
yes.
You're going to have to do something prior to the sale if you're not going to renovate it, whether that's just spraying Febreze all over the place or actually using a bleach product or mitigating the mold might be a smart thing to do.
Okay, so I'm asking you something that I want to understand here. So mold is typically a source caused by moisture. If you cut off the source of moisture and you treat it, shouldn't it stop the mold then? Like treat it professionally. I'm not talking about me buying the spray from Home Depot and spraying it.
Sometimes that might be good enough. So yeah, a wet, porous substrate to grow the microbial mold. And I think there's about 20 different types of mold we find in Houston. Some of them are carcinogenic, some of them are toxic, and some of them just look nasty. So yeah, we've had where we've taken care of homes and it's come back. The first thing is to find the source. We find it a lot under windows and window panes because windows aren't installed correctly. You know, the old candle test, you hold it up by the caulking or the panes and that blows in. Or bathtubs, right? They're always showing the bathtub overflows, it sinks in. Cabinetry, we're involved with a big project with kitchen cabinets that get mold, especially if you don't have air conditioning and some sort of dehumidifying. I bought a dehumidifier for my bathroom because it's not well ventilated, and I noticed if you look up at the outtakes for the air conditioning, you get all those black little spots. A cheap little, I'd say cheap, to me it's cheap, a little dehumidifier sucks the water out after you have your shower and your bath, and you kind of do preventative. But if it's a home that you're not in all the time, and there's no humidity control and no temperature control, and there is some sort of roof leak or window open, you're going to get mold.
Yeah, so you said what we commonly see a lot, and we try to avoid the word mold in our profession. Sometimes we might call it mildew until we test it and confirm that they are mold.
Yes, mildew is clever. Yeah.
But, so for example, you know, you go into a house and you see on the air vent, it's a lot of black spot. How do you know if that's something toxic or not toxic? Because I say this because sometimes we'll talk to the AC company and they say just, you know, dust collected. Like it could be that they just run the AC really low in the summer, cause a lot of condensation, adding with not keeping the house clean. When should I be worried?
Yeah, so I didn't want to mislead you. I just use that example. I see that on, I'm sure Shannon has it, no offense, on hers. I'm constantly cleaning. It doesn't mean it's mold. It could be something else. So there's something called a wipe test, and you're looking for the spores. And a microscopist has to look at a slide and identify the spores. And then after it's cleaned up, if it's so you get the visual off of there. And think about it, most of those are metal. So once it's with a bleach thing, and it may keep coming back. I'm more concerned with the ones that are on sheetrock that are not so easily treatable. Because if it's on sheetrock, what does that mean? This is a porous substance, so it's embedding itself. And where's it coming from? Is it if you have a brick home or stucco, is it that non-breathable wall cavity? A lot of us do get moisture inside that cavity, and that's those weep holes that try to drain that sweaty moisture out. But once it starts getting in that sheetrock and it gets into your breathable space, that's where you don't want it. When you start seeing it on your walls, your kitchens, cabinets, you're constantly interacting with that. And if you are, I guess, sensitive to that, that could cause you problems. And then also, I said some of these spores are toxicological. So when we clean it, there's mold outside. So we always compare it to the mold spore counts and types of mold outside, because you can't make it cleaner than what's already outside your home. So that's one of the end things when we clean it up and we do the fogging and whatever we can do. We compare the air once everything, the source is removed and the visual is removed, with the outside. You say, oh yeah, okay, now the mold counts are the same. So that's the best we can accomplish it.
Okay, that's good to know. Because I'll tell you an example here, a story. So I run a property management company for vacation rental. And this happened every now and then. Somebody go look where they shouldn't look, like where the AC, the unit, the condenser inside, and they'll open the closet and look. And then they'll say, oh, or look by the windowsill, for example, and start claiming that the property is infested with mold and is, hurting them and want a free stay.
Yeah. No, we get that a lot also with indoor air problems. People have small office buildings or small tenant spaces in these office buildings, and with the environment, I don't know if you're exposed to, but offices are not doing too well. There's a lot of vacancies post-COVID because of work at home. And so they're desperate to figure out what to do with these units. So some of them are converting them to apartments, and that's not the way these were set up, which means trying to put in utilities and drains. And some of the other folks are actually saying, look, let's put businesses in there like dry cleaners and spas and salons. So all of a sudden we get a call that an expensive tenant is noticing these odors from the 6 different places that moved in, the beauty salon, the spa. We had a place where we couldn't tell where the stench was coming from. Next door, they had rented to all these places where they had to somehow create drains for them. So the funny thing about this story is it wasn't the beauty spa, it wasn't the hair salon, because nothing matched. And it turned out to be, really quickly, it came from the person's unit. And unbeknownst, she'd have her cap up in the place. And then on Friday, she'd rinse out the little cat bottle into her drain. She thought somehow magically that drain went down 7 floors and went into a sanitary sewer. But this was a post kind of a rigging to make them a kitchen thing. So it was an on-demand pump. So if you didn't have enough water in the drain, it just sat there. Cat food and water inside the unit over the weekend. So we had to rig something that would pump it back through the ceiling and to the sanitary sewer.
Wow, who knew this conversation could get really interesting?
The cat food. No offense to your cat listeners out there.
Yeah, but don't dump it down the drain.
In an office building, that's not set up for it.
Yeah, but there's a trash can for that, though, right?
Well, she was rinsing it out, to be fair.
Yeah, I get you.
Should have walked to the bathroom, but
you have example, I bet you do, of like somebody, I know you said a story earlier that somebody was supposed to do the phase 1, but they didn't do it, and then they then couldn't sell it. What do you commonly see here in this area?
So Shannon will give you a good story of a phase 1 she did but they didn't realize who they rented the property. They kind of were trying to make money off an empty lot, and they rented it and didn't do due diligence.
Yeah, it essentially was supposed to be an empty parking lot that we were looking at, and I believe, were going to build apartments on it. So, we thought it was going to be a quick and easy phase one. And we go in person, as every environmental consultant should do. You're supposed to have, an on-site inspection. And someone was using it. Someone was renting out this parking lot. It was whomever was next door, and they were using it for essentially fracking. So they had built these weird concrete pools. So they had built something onto this property. There were then storage tanks and tubs all over the place full of unknown shiny liquids that had then been spilled. So had spills everywhere. Yeah, they had left quite a mess, essentially.
So the people knew they were renting it, but didn't do the diligence like you should do a post-rental, just like you do with anything else. Somebody leaving your house or someone as a tenant space in a commercial property, they sometimes leave problems behind. Now, I know sometimes it's a midnight exit and you can't do it. Now, they knew who rented it, so I'm sure behind the scenes they told them in no uncertain terms, you got to clean that up. But they had already paid us to do a phase one, which basically concluded for their bank, when they were trying to get money for the apartments, that there was environmental problems on it and it required testing and possibly corrective action.
Wow. So due diligence. I mean, you have to ask them, what are you doing? What are you intending to do with this lot?
Yeah. And it goes back to, I understand you want to rent something and you want to make money, but the phase one is, in all these testing is done by a third party if you want to pay them. And you can make smart decisions based on this. If anything comes out of this conversation, whether you utilize our services or not, is the fact that you should be aware. The more you keep your eyes closed, you can get into situations that you don't want to. Turn a property upside down, cause you a lot of hardship, legal. We haven't even talked about regulatory issues, because there's could be penalties from the EPA, our local Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is the local version of the EPA. At least gain the knowledge so you can decide, is the risk worth mitigating prior to a sale, prior to a purchase. Be knowledgeable.
It's being proactive, and a phase one, when done appropriately and correctly, also gives the buyer any history of the property as well, so you can be knowledgeable in that. We also recently had a phase one where they received a previous phase one that was done, so we could kind of compare notes. I think it's important when you're hiring an environmental consultant to see what their phase one looks like. I know we've had some work where we've had to come back in and do a phase one because whomever was hired before us didn't do a thorough enough job. They just kind of were like, hey, here's this 10-page report real quick. But, it should have a full breakdown of the property, what's surrounding the property, the history of the property. It should go into enough detail.
Yeah, we've seen some drive-by reports where they don't even put boots on the ground. I mean, real estate people have open houses. You talked about someone looking in the closets and all that. We don't like to be inspected, but sometimes being the ostrich and putting your head in the ground is not always a good strategy.
So what do you guys do most of your work here in Harris County?
Yeah, we're primarily in Harris County. We do projects in all the adjoining states, not as often. New Mexico, Oklahoma, we have a project ongoing right now in Louisiana. The cities vary. Obviously, Houston is a large metropolis. We have projects in San Antonio, Austin. I've even had some single-family houses in the middle of smaller towns, like out in Dayton. Didn't bring this up, but there are problems that we deal, since I'm a geologist, with strange things that happen in your home, like subsidence or faults, or improper compression prior to building. So we've looked at some buildings, and you can imagine what it's like in your home, and all of a sudden it's sinking, like it happened in this home out in Liberty County. And she thought it was a chemical plant from a mile away, and I was like, well, that seems kind of strange. But unfortunately, I had to tell her after we did a bunch of borings and samples that her dad built the home, and he brought in a bunch of fill soil that was not appropriate, and the home was slowly settling. So that's an unusual problem. We don't get to do that very often, but that's another thing. The faults, also an issue. We have over 250 faults in the Harris County area. They're not the same as the San Andreas in California, in that they are slow-moving faults that are sliding slowly towards the Gulf. Every once in a while, it's opposite. And because we used to rely a lot on groundwater for our drinking water, and now we switch to reservoir water, it's slowing down that sinking. But there were huge problems for homes in Jersey City in that they were noticing cracks in their foundation. And you cannot fix those types of cracks as opposed to our typical pilings that we need on what we call shrink swell clays. Shrink swell clays are a 15-foot problem. So you put piers down below 15 feet so the clay doesn't swell in the rain or shrink in the dry weather. Faults are thousands of feet below the ground, so you're not going to drill something that deep economically to fix your home. So people.
How often does a fall affect the foundation of the home? Not very often, though, does it?
If you buy or sell homes along the Long Point Fault, it's called, which runs along Long Point, strangely enough, it's the same name. There are homes that are unsellable west of downtown, sort of where Beltway and I-10 are. And some of
Are you talking about Long Point Street here in Spring Branch? That's where the fault is?
Yeah, I can drive you to places where the streets dip a couple of feet down, and that's from past fault movement, and sometimes it goes right through a home.
Okay, next time I drive through Long Point, I'm gonna look.
Not every home is a fault. Yeah, you could. It's very famous. We used to take people around. It's not a happy subject to see where it breached. You can see the garage door, and then it pinches off because it's not level anymore. And at least once a month we get a phone call, please come out and take a look. My realtor says there may be the Long Point Fault in the area. That's the most notorious of our faults. But like I said, there's 250 of them plus in the area.
Well, I was looking at a house once over near that area in Spring Branch, but it didn't have that problem. The problem they had was the middle of the house was always wet. It just won't drain. Like it's the wood floor buckle up, whatever they put was always wet. And it's a house I wouldn't want to touch because I don't know how I'm going to fix that problem.
So the water came into the home?
It must have come in from somewhere, but the middle of the house was buckling up, like it was higher. It was weird, but it was always wet, and you can tell because the floor was new, and they told us that they had to change the floor all the time.
We had a home, and I'll pass this on, although it's the same example you got. I don't remember what they were doing, but for some reason they had to dig onto the foundation for whatever reason, and as soon as they dug the hole, it was full of water and it hadn't rained. Wherever they dug next to the home, there was water under the home. And they were like, we're checking our water meter. We don't have a leak. Long story short, it turned out to be their swimming pool on a separate line had a leak. I finally asked after about 2 or 3 hours, and he said, yeah, we thought we fixed that, but yeah, the meter's always moving for the water. So the swimming pool had some sort of leak, not from the swimming pool, but the line that does the chlorination in there. And so that was...
The neighbor's swimming pool?
No, it was their swimming pool.
Oh.
We were so focused on something being under the house, but half these problems is trying to find the source, like we talked about with mold. And in this one, I should have been more attuned to looking at the swimming pool. But we were measuring the water and looking at her water notes. Water and its accumulation is a big problem. We usually have 1 or 2 studies a year where we're having to figure out where water is coming from that's causing mold, subsidence, damage. And it's not fun because water travels in different obtuse kind of directions and is controlled by natural and man-made things. And it's interesting, once you find it, you feel good, but in the process, you wake up, as I told Shannon, at 2 o'clock in the morning, where my brain has been thinking about it all night. I wake up and go, swimming pool,
You got a lot of water there in that pool.
A quick little story about water. So the sidewalk in front of this person's house was constantly settling. So we redid the sidewalk, filled it back in, and it settled again. So it turned out, long story short, is he had a roof drain, and the roof drain, he claimed, it was a flat roof home, drained the whole roof, it was supposed to go underground and attached to a storm sewer line. Well, when we opened it up, it wasn't attached to the storm sewer. So it was constantly flooding in that area between the home and the sidewalk. And so he was trying to fix the problem, and he was wasting money constantly because it was washing out again and again. Yeah.
So we're just putting on a Band-Aid instead of fixing the real problem.
You have to find the source. You got to find
Right.
like
Yeah.
mold or chemical leak or all the strange things that can happen to you. If you don't fix the source, which is hard, it's like a doctor diagnosing a problem. You take an aspirin because you have a headache every day, and sometimes you have to maybe ask what's causing this headache.
Yeah. One extra glass of wine could do that.
With sulfites.
Okay, so we talked a little bit before we hit the record button. And when you said flooding, it reminded me of this because, we go and look at property with septic. And one of the things that we look at when they say they have a septic is it wet around the septic area? And if it is, there may be issue with the septic. But from your professional eyes, you see a whole different set of problem than what I see. What I see is how much is it going to cost me to replace the septic? But what you see is something else.
Yeah, well, it's similar. About once a year, we have a septic problem because most of the things we do are in urban environments. People tend to do things a little differently out in the suburbs, way out when you deal with septic. So we've had cases. I remember one up in Tomball where they were going to buy a home, and what was holding up the sale is the gentleman had a workshop, and they were worried about his hobby type activities, his mineral spirits, his paints, going into the septic field. And like you said, it's wet. And the people buying it were very sensitive to chemical problems, financially sensitive. So we had to go and test the area. And that happens like about once a year, where a knowledgeable buyer is buying a single family home, and they do the phase one, which I said is unusual with homes, and they find a septic field and start asking questions. Have you only been putting down what's supposed to be down? They had a gentleman who was running a carousel, which this is really weird. He kind of ran out of his home a carousel painting business. And you could tell right away with the phase one that there were not hobby horses, but those horses in the carousel, and he was painting them. But he had just a normal residential septic system, so it had to be cleaned up from a chemical perspective. And then there is all sorts of regulations about the septic water is not supposed to come out so it's being poorly drained or overused or clogged. So once it comes out, it's a health problem. I've seen where there was, not to be gross, but toilet paper or things that shouldn't be on the surface of a septic field, and they were there, and it's unsanitary. And in this one case, the neighbor called and complained to a city entity, and they were written up, and they had to show proof that they had dug up the septic field, re-engineered it so it was appropriate, tried to find out if there was a problem with the actual solids tank, and it was fixed up. Single family home, who would have expected that in the country?
Every now and then we run into septic here in the city. There's some older neighborhood that still have septic, and most of them are on city waters, so it's fine. But whenever they have a small lot and they got septic and well, that's when we a little worry.
The water wells are a problem for us too. Fresno, I think it's Fresno, and I'm not talking the one near Dallas, if I'm remembering the name right. There's an area just south of Houston near Beltway 8.
Frisco?
Frisco, thank you.
There's one, yeah.
I knew Fresno should be right. I was touch with Frisco. And the problem, it emanated from a gas station out of release. When a gas station has a release, you're obligated within 30 days of finding this release of identifying all the water well owners within a half mile. We were shocked. Everybody had a water well, yet the city has given everybody water. They just never, some of them were using it to water their lawns. Very few people were drinking out of it. So we tried to make an argument, even though there were over 50 water wells in the area, that we shouldn't be held to a high standard because no one's using it to drink. But the state says, look, that's no guarantee that they're not drinking it. The hosts are using it anyway. So it caused a significant problem for our client. He was even willing to pay for them to plug all these little shallow wells. They were all 30 feet and 40 feet. And if you know anything about water wells, that's not very protective. Number one, you don't get a lot of water at that depth. It dries up. Number two, anything that happens to come on the ground will get into your water well. So, hence you go.
What's the appropriate depth for a water well?
Well, it's not allowed in the city of Houston anymore, or it's very difficult. Our water wells, I've seen 1,000 to 5,000 feet in depth. Some commercial facilities want to go deeper. We have something called the Chico, the Evangeline, and the Jasper aquifers. They're all deeper, and sometimes the deeper you go, you get better water quality, more yield. A single-family home is predicated on a certain usage. I think it's 100 gallons a day or 200 gallons a day or something like that. There was some recent legislation that said if you're going to build a subdivision, you need to prove that you have adequate water supply, either from reservoir or the aquifer, to provide for your subdivision. I guess there were some problems. So now they're doing all these studies prior to, especially where Shannon lives. I think they still rely on water wells, and I saw them drilling a water well in this area that she lives in, and I'm sure they had to do that study to prove that there was enough water for the people, and the quality was good.
I don't know. I like well, but I feel like it's too much work to make sure that water is safe to use.
Have you tried well water? Some of it's really good. It's sweet almost, some of it.
I used to live in Colorado for a little bit, and the water there is feel a lot cleaner, than here. But no, it's been a long time since I tried well water.
We don't have so many snow and ice melts. We're relying on other types of water that may not have that pleasant of a taste. And plus, it's a trade-off. We're an industrial area that the United States depends on for oil, gas, other types of things. And so sometimes the chemicals that are used for this process get into the water, and that's not so good.
Okay, so I know we're coming up on the hour. Let's touch on something really quick. Beside what's required by the lender, are there tests that required by the government official that it must be done, and on what type of properties?
Right. So Shannon's going to have to help me because we wrote it down. So there's best practices, which I alluded to. You should, as a smart investor, you do your due diligence. We do a lot of work for chain businesses, gas stations or fast food restaurants, and they do a heck of a lot of work prior to picking out a property. And demographics, traffic, and then by the time they come to us, they say, oh, by the way, how's the environmental doing? And they'll make a decision whether to buy it or not, betting on what we say. As far as law, there's a brownfields all appropriate inquiry rule, and it's more of a punishment if there's something wrong than a requirement. In other words, if you buy a piece of property without doing the phase one, the due diligence, and it turns out there's an environmental problem, you're subject to all the sales investment problems as well as regulatory fines. They are not going to try to find the previous person. You now own the property. It's called all appropriate inquiry, and it's fairly recent rule. The original was in 1990s. If anything, it's become more and more strict. So lenders jump on that because they don't want to be responsible in case the owner defaults on his loan. The other situation, which we see happen occasionally, is the neighbor. The city of Houston, or some city entities, have a police department in environmental crimes. So if you're running a business out of your home, or you're getting a little sloppy with your lobby, or your contractor did some work and dumped some chemicals or even concrete, they could call the police. And then all of a sudden, the police are not going to correct it, the Environmental Crime Division. They're going to basically say, you need to hire a consultant and clean this up. So that's the second one. And now you're going to help me with the third.
When you have, we talked about this a little bit, but when you're doing the demolitions and renovations and making sure that the workers are safe, because if you're coming in and doing a demolition and there was mold and asbestos, you're putting your workers at risk because you didn't take the precautions of, looking and making sure that it was clean beforehand.
And it's a law. So we have to submit a 10-day notification prior to demolition of mostly commercial structures, because of the argument that asbestos is released. Once you start pounding it with a big old ball or a bulldozer, you're endangering the workers, so you're opening up yourself to contamination. But they're smart. This law has been around a while. So they'll ask for an asbestos survey, and they'll want to see that what's known as the 10-day notification, that you inform the state. State finds a midnight serious demolition project, and they're not going to like that much. So that's another instance of something that's required by the law.
The asbestos is, and pardon my ignorance, but it's only dangerous when it's being broken, the dust, right? If it just sits, it's fine.
I mean, Steve McQueen, famous actor, he got it from asbestosis from grinding brakes. And it all came about from a HERA, a regulation involved schools. So you think about it, the government was trying to protect themselves once it found out that asbestos, when breathed in, cannot be handled by the body and causes lung cancer and other different types of cancer. So they said, we are forcing children to go to these buildings, and we could be blamed for this. So most school districts now have abatement of asbestos or encapsulation or something called an operation and maintenance plan, and you're right. So just because there's asbestos there doesn't mean it's dangerous. It's when it's a bad example, but nailing something into a wall, or somebody's trying to put in computer cable and they're messing with the ceiling and the things are coming down. So your O&M plan says, hey, you can't do some of those activities because asbestos is identified in these, or just replacing floor tile, because floor tile has it. So if you don't remove it, then you have to have a plan to either cover it over or just warn people so that only licensed people can handle the material.
Yeah, but it's also long-term exposure or repeated exposure. It's not like I inhaled asbestos one time, now I'm going to have cancer.
Right. That's always been my feeling, but it's very hard to make that argument. Quick toxicity lesson. There's toxic compounds and there's carcinogenic compounds. So toxicity, like everything around us, is toxic. You drink too much milk, cinnamon powder, you get to a point where you've done damage to you, right?
Chocolate.
It reaches a certain concept of chocolate. Well, it's a different type of toxicity. It's worth the effort. You get to a certain level and you damage your organs. Carcinogen, I like to think of it as every time you're exposed to it, you roll the dice. And sooner or later you get the double ones or double sixes, whatever the number is, and that's the time the fiber embeds in you. Or benzene is a carcinogen. You're exposed to, there was a big argument about filling up your gas tanks and smelling it. And how many times could you do that before you ended up with some sort of form of cancer from benzene in our fuel? So it's a crapshoot. It's like riding a bike or a motorcycle without a helmet. I can do it today. I'm just going to the store. I'm just gonna one time fill up gas, and then the other times I'm not gonna breathe during the process. It's every time you expose yourself to something that's carcinogenic, it's that. So all these things we talked about today are risk versus reward, risk versus pain, the pain point of paying for it, or knowing about it when you didn't want to know about it. And then you evaluate it. Yeah, I know I have mold in the house, but I'm just going to walk around with a mask all the time. All right. At least you know about it and you try to deal with something. What about your guests?
This has been really interesting, very interesting conversation. Now, if the audience wants to learn more, how do they get in touch with you?
So our company is called Terrain Solutions Incorporated. We're in Southwest Houston, 10103 Fondren Road. The easier way is we do have a website called www.terrain, which is TERRAIN, terrain is land, solutions, SOLUTIONS, INC, Inc.com. And the website has a request for proposal. Our phone number, if you want a quicker response, Shannon may get to it because she's young and she can get to the phone quicker, is 713-467-2900. And we work for U-Densities. We have a contract with the city of Houston, but we also work for, individual homeowners. We have a big heart because we're all a bunch of families, and she has young children and my children are all grown. But so give us a shot if other people won't answer the phone. There's no job too small.
Well, that is all. And I hope you found this episode informative and help you to mitigate risk in your next investment opportunity. If you do find this episode helpful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because we are dropping fresh content like this every week to help you crush it in 2025. And if you've got questions or comments, please drop them below. I love to hear from you. I read them all. So thank you and catch you in the next video.